everyone, and welcome to this episode on the Nutmegs and Knee Sides podcast. Right now, there is a big question that is probably not getting asked about enough in the footballing world. That question is, what is going on in Turkey? This summer alone, Turkish football has been joined by the likes of Premier League winner Leandro Trossard, multi-Premier League title, Golden Boot, playmaker, and Champions League winner, and one of the all-time greats of the Premier League, Mohamed Salah. They've also been joined by Romelu Lukaku, a well-renowned striker, and also Nathan Ake, one of Manchester City's best defenders over the last few years. Now, that's not to mention, as well, a number of the other players who have also gone to the Turkish league in the last few years. A few prime examples being Victor Osimhen and Marco Asensio. A few more players, notably such as Ciro Immobile, Andre Onana, and many more. Now, here's the question. What exactly is going on in Turkey right now? Is this a new wave for football, or is this just a new potential retirement league? Well, here we go. Let's break it down. So, let's rewind the clocks back a few years. In 2021-22, that season right there, it was an interesting one. Arguably back then, Turkey didn't have any star players in their football league, you know? Galatasaray finished, I believe, 12th in the league. Awful season for them, but still a big name in Turkish football. Now, here's the thing. That very next year, they managed to go back to the top of the Turkish Super League, and in the last few years, they've won all the league titles. Now, in that year, obviously they signed Juan Mata after his contract with Man United ended. But in that following year, they also made a few more signings, such as Hakim Ziyech from Chelsea and Wilfried Zaha on a free from Crystal Palace when his contract expired. Mauro Icardi joined. Former Arsenal midfielder Lucas Torreira joined. So there was a number of good players that were somewhat choosing to go to Turkey, and in fact, they weren't exactly washed. And what I mean by washed or finished is I'm talking like not necessarily, they don't have to be old, but like a lot of those players, maybe like Hakim Ziyech was still a relatively young player, you know, and then you've got a few other players, you know, Wilfried Zaha arguably could have stayed at Crystal Palace for a while. Mauro Icardi potentially. Obviously PSG. He was on loan from Galatasaray from PSG, and that was in their era of being incredibly full of great attackers. You know, your Messi, Neymar, Mbappe, Di Maria. So naturally, he got no game time at all, and so Galatasaray came calling. Now, in the last few years, Galatasaray have also gone on to sign Leroy Sané, Victor Osimhen. They've also managed to sign more good players. Like even I forgot to mention him as well. After their horrendous campaign, they managed to sign Napoli's all-time top goal scorer, Dries Mertens, who was a big player for them. So yeah, they had somewhat of a good pull, Galatasaray. Now, Galatasaray, you look at what they did there, and you think we're on our way to another one-team league. We're on our way to another Liga. We're on our way to another Bundesliga, where the same team wins it every single year. And to an extent, that has been correct because obviously they have, like I've just said, they have won, I believe, all of the league titles since that 12th place finish. However, the league has become somewhat more competitive. You look at their two other Istanbul counterparts, Besiktas, who have gone and obviously he doesn't play there now. He's just retired, by the way. They signed Ciro Immobile, who is, a very good um, icon in Italian football and specifically in the Serie A. He's scored many goals. I believe he's fourth in the all-time rankings for Serie A. That's very good. Even in Lewandowski's brilliant year where he, won the treble and was the top scorer in all the competitions he played and all those goals, Ciro Immobile still scored more league goals than Lewandowski did. Granted that it might have been because that, Serie A's got more games than the Bundesliga does. So that's probably an advantage for Ciro Immobile. But still, nevertheless, he's a great player, and Besiktas managed to sign him. Now, you look at Besiktas now, and just not too long ago, they had Tammy Abraham before he's obviously been poached by Aston Villa, and he returned obviously to Istanbul to win the Europa League with the Birmingham club, not Birmingham City. Any Villa fans that hear that will not be happy. But you know, it's Besiktas's recent business. They had Ole Gunnar Solskjaer recently, who's a decent manager, but obviously it still doesn't work out. When you bring in a Premier League manager, it doesn't matter how good your opposition is, you're still expected to go far. You're still expected to win. You're still expected to get good results. I guess they didn't really do that to the extent that they thought they could. But you look at Besiktas now, and honestly, they've got a couple good players already. But now look at Besiktas. One of the most shocking transfers I found in this whole transfer window was Leandro Trossard, who is a Premier League winner with Arsenal now, and he can. Who knows what else he can win with Arsenal? Obviously, they have just signed Solis, the Greek winger. Although, they didn't do that before Trossard was sold. You know, so I think when you when you look at Besiktas, it's a very interesting move that they've done. And the other one that surprised me is Dusan Vlahovic. Dusan Vlahovic, who has been on the radar for a number of years from a number of clubs, but he's never really got that move. Because Vlahovic came through at Fiorentina, and then 6 months after Ronaldo left Juventus, they brought him in to replace him pretty much. He's not quite lived up to that. And, Juventus are in an era now where they're not like the team that they were 10, 20 years ago. Some people go as far as to say they've got no world class players in their squad and haven't for a few years now, which is kind of sad to think that a club like Juventus is in a state like that now. But here's the thing about Dusan Vlahovic. I mean, Dusan Vlahovic, he's a free agent, he's a striker, a number of teams could go in for him. But the thing is, that's the theory that a number of teams could go in for him. Who needs him though? Like, he's not going to go to Juventus because they've obviously just let him go on a free. He doesn't want to be there. Juventus doesn't want him there. So, and Juventus have had a bit of a striker problem or a problem with any sort of goals. So, like, yeah, Juventus doesn't want him. Milan doesn't really need a striker. Inter definitely doesn't need a striker. A number of those clubs don't need a striker. So then you look abroad. And like, yeah, Bayern Munich definitely don't need a striker. PSG don't need a striker. Manchester City don't need a striker. Liverpool don't need a striker. Chelsea don't need a striker. Arsenal don't need a striker. So like a lot of these players and these clubs, they don't need a striker. And let's be fair, the elite clubs, the clubs that I've just named are some of the elite clubs in football. And it doesn't matter if you're a free agent, they will not sign you unless you are a goal machine and you can guarantee them goals, you can guarantee them trophies. So yeah. So that's another question about Turkish football. I mean, is it a bit of like an outlet for these players maybe who can't get a squad place or aren't quite good enough or just haven't had the best of luck with things like that and other clubs being filled up, you know? And if you shift away to from Besiktas. You've also got Fenerbahce. And Fenerbahce, in the last few years, you look at Fenerbahce's current squad, you've got Edison, Nelson Semedo, Nathan Ake, Milan Skriniar, Matteo Guendouzi, N'Golo Kante, Romelu Lukaku, Anderson Talisca, Marco Asensio. That is a really good team. And over the last few years, I know some of them have been sold, but they had Youssef En-Nesyri, they had Sofian Amrabat, they had Dominik Livakovic. Like they've had some. Those are some good players, and they're all going to Fenerbahce. Now, here's the thing: you have to ask why, because even Jose Mourinho, who's a multi-European trophy winner, multi-league winner, he's a serial winner, Jose Mourinho, and he's got a job at Fenerbahce. He's once not like they've offered him the job, obviously, I believe, but he's said yes to it. Like whether that's his only option, you don't know. I believe when Ruben Amorim did get the sack from Man United, he said, "Oh, I've got unfinished business at Man United. I wouldn't mind, coming back there." So yeah, I mean, whether that is the reason why, but you know, when you look at why they went there in the end, Jose Mourinho, he goes there because he's out of a job. He needs a new manager's job. Um, Edison's gone there because Manchester City have been, looking at new goalkeepers. Obviously, they had James Trafford and Gianluigi Donnarumma last year, so Edison's not really going to play. Um, look at other players. But here's the thing: Milan Skriniar, old. Nelson Semedo, pretty old. You know, Romelu Lukaku, somewhat old now. He's what 33, 34 maybe, so he is definitely getting into those older years, and he's been a bit inconsistent over the last few years, so that's probably a factor with Romelu Lukaku. Um, Matteo Guendouzi somewhat old. N'Golo Kante somewhat old. N'Golo Kante I feel is a bit unlucky, sorry, because of his last year at Chelsea, how it went with his injuries, and how it went with Chelsea signing players like Moises Caicedo, um, Enzo Fernandez. They had, I believe, Jorginho left in the January window, but yeah, they went on to sign a lot of players, Chelsea. So I guess that's a factor to why N'Golo Kante left. He went to Saudi though, and then he went back to Fenerbahce. Same happened with John Duran, who joined Fenerbahce on loan. Um, yeah, I mean, a lot of those players, you look at the name and you think, oh, they're players who are either old or probably past their best. Like if like if Jude Bellingham became available tomorrow, and like they said, which clubs are interested in buying Jude Bellingham, like Fenerbahce aren't going to be on that list for Jude, you know. However, if a player who's maybe a bit older and maybe a bit more past his time, could be a bit more cheaper, because you got to remember that Fenerbahce and Turkish football, even Galatasaray, Besiktas, all the clubs I just mentioned, they're not as big as these Premier League teams. They're not as big as your Man United, your Real Madrid, the Barcelonas. Therefore, they won't have as much revenue, so they don't have hundreds of millions of pounds to spend on new players. So if a player comes on the cheap, they will take it. Romelu Lukaku's only cost them like €7 million, which is a very good price. Edison didn't cost them that much. I guess they choose to spend their money more on the wages and the salaries than the actual transfer fees. But yeah, I mean that is that is the thing. Fenerbahce even as well have looked to make a lot of big signings. Think you're better than me at fantasy football? How about we find out? If you want, join the Nutmegs and Knee Slides Fantasy Premier League team before the season starts, and we might just have to sell this in the game. Or the players will. Join code is LAKPH4 and anyone who's interested. So, see you there. Now back to the video. And then if you like, even again, like those are your three big Turkish clubs, your Istanbul clubs, but like there's more clubs that have made business, such as Trabzonspor. How they've signed Andre Onana again on loan, but big move for Mohamed Salah. And like Trabzonspor and some other clubs, they've had players, might be a few years ago, but still, Daniel Sturridge, Balotelli, Nani, like those are some players that have gone to Turkey. So the question then is why? Why are all these players looking towards Turkey? Now, here's what I think. I don't think that Turkey is the most appealing place for a young aspiring footballer who wants to win a Champions League. Because again, money's not everything in football. How much you spend isn't everything. However, it can often play a factor. Like, we've seen obviously the bigger clubs are the ones that win the Champions League, and it might not be a direct factor, but all those clubs do make a lot more money than the clubs that don't win Champions Leagues and don't win big trophies. So, yeah, I mean, when you look at that, it's often a case of what can Turkey give that these European clubs can't. Now, one of them might be a bit easier competition. Like we seen with Saudi Arabia, maybe not so much, or maybe I guess in the last while, they don't spend like 80, 90, £100 million on their players, but they will spend like truckloads on their wages. That's the appealing part. A bit of a lifestyle, a bit of cash and money is a big incentive. Turkey's obviously the place for. I know people say it as a joke. Like how in Turkey it's full of like hair transplants and teeth, dentistry transplants. Like how they do a lot of stuff like that in Turkey. They say it as a joke, but it's a factor. Like Turkey's renowned for that kind of stuff. And again, as players get older, they might fancy stuff like that. But Turkish football. This is what I think is the big thing about Turkish football and why it's so good. If you flash back to a couple years ago, I mentioned him already, Victor Osimhen. Now, Osimhen had just two. Osimhen had won Serie A with Napoli, the Scudetto title. He won the Golden Boot, and then the very next year, Napoli struggled a lot. Eighth place finish. Um, didn't go very well with a lot of the players. Osimhen, I believe he was very hurt by Napoli because he got somewhat racially abused by the own club's social media. Um, yeah, so yeah, with that, he wanted an outlet. It was all kind of known that he was going to try and get out of the club. Now, um, a lot of clubs were in for his signature, I guess. My understanding was that the two big ones for Victor Osimhen's signature were Chelsea and Al Ali in Saudi Arabia. So those were the two big clubs. Al Ali, I believe, eventually, maybe not that summer exactly, but they chose to go for Ivan Toney, and they'd signed Riyad Mahrez. They signed a few players, to be fair, and Chelsea opted to sign Nicholas Jackson because, granted, Antonio Conte had just come in. Osman had fallen out with them. Conte wanted him sold. Osman wanted to leave. But when you had a player like Victor Osimhen, he was still a good player, and they would not just let him go for a cheap price. They still wanted 80, 90 million euros for him. Now, transfer deadline day comes along, and there's no offer. Nothing's happened. Nothing's materialized. No one's looked to try and sign Victor Osimhen. So the transfer window is closed, but Galatasaray then comes in because they know that Osimhen wants to leave. So they submit a loan deal just for that season to, to sign him. And the reason why that deal was able to be done is because Turkey's transfer window is actually finishes a week later than the rest of the football world. So because of that, Turkey were able to, and Galatasaray were basically unrivaled in their pursuit of Victor Osimhen. Like staying at Napoli was not an option for Osimhen, so he had to leave. Galatasaray were the only option. He goes to Galatasaray. He does really well there, and then he gets bought by them permanently for like 70, 80 million. That was a big deal, but if you look at how it's gone for Galatasaray as of late, it's definitely been worth it for the club. Now, again, that is probably a good thing for Turkish football. If their transfer window ends a week later than the rest of football, then that is basically saying that any footballers who want to leave or want to transfer that haven't got their transfer by the end of the deadline day, they can still come to Turkey. We can still get the deals, and that's the best part. If Chelsea and Al Ali were still in that race for Victor Osimhen, they would be unrivaled with Galatasaray because they cannot get that move until January because their transfer window was already over. By January comes along, if they do want to buy Osimhen, who knows what happened because he probably wouldn't have played football for 6 months. So that's probably a big advantage for Turkey. It's a lifeline. It's like the way of players um going there when they've not got anything else. They've not got anywhere else to go. So like, yes, that's probably a reason why they might want to go there. But yeah, the thing is though, this is somewhat my warning to Turkish football, and this isn't like a this could even be good news for Turkish football, or it could be bad news. Depends how the league goes about it. But here's the thing: if Turkish football, like I named that whole Galatasaray team, they can field a very good starting 11. Galatasaray, not Galatasaray. Well, yes, Galatasaray actually, but Fenerbahce. I named Fenerbahce's whole starting 11. They can field an 11 of very good and well-known players. But here's the problem: if all these big, good players start coming to Turkey, one of the things that applies or appeals maybe that looks attractive to a player, say maybe like Romelu Lukaku or Edison or Milan Skriniar or Ilkay Gundogan. I've not mentioned him yet, but yeah, he's gone to Galatasaray too, and he was another case of going to Galatasaray after the transfer window had closed from Man City. But yeah, um, Ilkay Gundogan, Romelu Lukaku, Skriniar, Guendouzi, um, Sane again as well as a player who maybe is somewhat past his best days of football, but yeah, he's playing for Galatasaray and he's a big player for them as far as big names go, Leroy Sane. But here's the thing, like I said, if all these good players start coming to Galatasaray, what's appealed to those older players is that the level of competition isn't as high compared to the Premier League, La Liga, Serie A, Bundesliga. The level of competition and the intensity is not as high. If you bring more of those players into Turkey, into that league, it either goes one of two ways. And this depends on what the clubs and the league itself do. Either the league becomes a lot harder, and all of these players who have come because they're a bit older and they're big names which are good for the league and good for the clubs, they can't compete, so they're not good enough, and they eventually either leave or retire, maybe. That's one way of going. The other way it goes is that the league's competition, rises, becomes a more appealing league, and more, maybe not great world class players, or at least not for the first few years, maybe, but they might not come. But a few good players might come to Turkey, and a few good players that are maybe homegrown in Turkey, like Arda Güler was with Fenerbahce, like Kerem Aktürkoğlu is, like a number of other Turkish players are Kokcu, if maybe that convinces them players to stay. Like I compared what young fans think about Cristiano Ronaldo and how Portugal haven't always been this big footballing nation. I could apply that same logic to League Earn because for the last 10 or so years, since like Zlatan and Thiago Silva and Verratti and Neymar and all those players moved to PSG, that's when the league became relevant. And again, the younger players have made the mistake of thinking that League Earn was always in the top five league. It might have been the worst of the top five leagues, but it was still up there. It wasn't always, before League Earn, when PSG and all that money came in, it was somewhat irrelevant. So whether we could see that same thing happen with Turkey and the league becomes more appealing and Turkish football grows as a whole, we could see that, but we never know. But one of the things I definitely wanted to bring up is that a lot of the Turkish football. I've just done a whole thing saying that it is quite good for the league and the clubs and all that, and for their image in the footballing world, what they're doing. But they've actually gone into Manchester United and have tried to submit, I believe, a 50 odd million euro bid for Premier League Player of the Season, Bruno Fernandes. And again, like I can say to them, know your place. I mean, as a Manchester United fan, like we're not just gonna sell Bruno, especially after he's just won the Premier League Player of the Season, playmaker. He's done all that. At the moment, the state of the Turkish league, like it's not in a bad state, but a player does not move to the Turkish league right now when they're in their prime or when they're approaching their prime. You know, like Bruno Fernandes, he's got a keen project ahead of him at Manchester United, and you think he's going to throw it away for Galatasaray. Whatever Galatasaray or the Turkish league can offer him to come, like Man United will offer greater. Like he's loved by the fans. He's a club legend, and yeah. So you can say that with Bruno Fernandes, whether he won't accept it. The club has outright come out after this bid and have said Bruno Fernandes is not for sale at all. Right. So yeah, I mean, you look at you look at that. For now, I would say the Turkish league, know your place, You can't get a Bruno Fernandes. You can't get a Jude Bellingham. You can't get an Erling Haaland. You can't get an Mbappe. You can't get a Michael Olise. You can get a Romelu Lukaku. You can get a Victor Osimhen. You can get a Dusan Vlahovic. You can get a Leroy Sané. You can get a Nathan Ake. You can get all those players. And that's the thing. Look at League Earn. League Earn started out like what the Turkish league is in a state of now. With the right investment, the right players, it can come out and it can be maybe contested as a top five league. But the wrong players and the wrong investment are only going to bring the league back, and it will just be another circle where, Turkey is only considered a light competitor in football, and yeah, and it doesn't get that much praise. But yes, only time will tell. Bruno Fernandes definitely isn't not going to go to Galatasaray, but you know, um, yeah, I think it would be worth maybe coming back to this in a couple weeks' time, and seeing whether Galatasaray or Fenerbahce or Besiktas or any Turkish clubs in general do make unrivaled moves for players because they have later transfer windows. But yeah, that will be something to take care of when it happens in a few weeks' time on deadline day. Um, Speaking of that, Turkish football, they do, to conclude it, Turkish football, they do have good potential in their players and their teams, and their fans. I can definitely say that Turkish football's got some of the best fans. Galatasaray fans, Fenerbahce fans, they're some of the loudest and brightest and biggest fan bases, not biggest fan bases, but maybe some most supportive fan bases in football. So they do have hope, they do have something there, but you need to build off it right. And again, when you are competing against the likes of Manchester United, Real Madrid, Barcelona, Liverpool, all them for credibility and popularity in the football world, especially when they're on higher revenues and everything, it's going to be very hard. Um, but yes, with that, I want to step on now to a few transfers. The Here We Go has been given for Rodri to move to Barcelona. He's flown in there now, and the club is expected any day now to make the official announcement. And yeah, like I said, I've looked at Barcelona in the last few seasons in the Champions League. And that's the only thing they're missing, Copa del Rey, Super Copa, La Liga, they've won it all in the last few years. That's what they're missing, I think, now. That is what I think they need, Barcelona. Because you look at how close they came to beating Inter, how they nearly pulled off a comeback against Atletico Madrid last year. Barcelona, very, very good on the wing, in defence, in goal, you know? They might not have much money, but the name Barcelona still means a lot. But that missing piece that they probably have had is in that midfield. Pedri, Gavi, De Jong, Fermin. There's always something. I never think they've tried and got their right midfield that they need to win big trophies and go far in Europe. I think now they might have it. If they have potentially Rodri as a holding midfielder, and we've seen his class for Man City, and we've seen how bad City have gone to when they've not had Rodri. We've seen how important he is for Spain in World Cups and European Championships. So, yeah, Rodri is a holding midfielder. Pedri is maybe a box to box. And Fermin Lopez, I think, is their next best attacking mid. Maybe Danny Olmo. But yeah, I think it'll depend on whether Olmo or Fermin, whichever one Flick prefers, and whichever one works harder in training and performs better on match day, will probably get the start. But I think with a midfield like that, they will probably be rivaling, teams like PSG for who has got the best midfield in world football. And yeah, I think that they I think Rodri could be the missing piece of Barcelona's puzzle of going 10, 11 years without a Champions League trophy. Like he could be their answer to obviously not their answer to Messi. Messi and Rodri, different players, different positions in that. But Rodri, as a holding midfielder, could be their missing piece of the puzzle. There's obviously been Lewandowski depart, and Ferran Torres has also gone to PSG as well for decent money. I don't know where he'll start or whether he'll get in over Dembele or Kvaratskhelia or how Luis Enrique plans to utilise him. But I think that if they can get a striker, Barcelona, they will probably be one of the favourites for the Champions League next year. Even without a striker, I'd say they're probably one of the favourites because they'll always find a way. Maybe Danny Olmo plays at a false nine, maybe Rafinha goes up top, maybe Anthony Gordon goes up top. Adeyemi could do it, maybe. I don't know. Who knows what Hansi Flick is going to do? But at the moment, I would say Barcelona are very heavy favourites to, um, win the Champions League. Um, and then the other big transfer, this actually shocked me overnight. Guillermo Vicario is going to leave Tottenham Hotspur to go to Juventus. This is actually pretty exciting for Juventus because I think that not ever since Chesney, ever since I think Gianluigi Buffon left the first time, after 2018, I believe, when he went to PSG. After that, I think they've somewhat struggled to replace him. They tried Wojciech Szczesny. They brought back Buffon, whether it was a backup or a first choice. Szczesny was okay. I don't believe Jamie Carragher's saying that Szczesny's always been an average goalkeeper. I think sometimes he's been very good. and he's definitely proved it for Arsenal and for Juventus at times, particularly Barcelona, where he's come out of retirement to play for them when they needed a goalkeeper, and obviously he's still there, I believe, as their backup. But yeah, credit to Chesney because he is decent, but he's not quite like I said before. Juventus is at an era now where they don't have any world class players. They don't have the star players that they might want to have. So yeah, do I think Vicario's world class as a goalkeeper? I'd say probably not. But Di Gregorio and that, it's an upgrade. It's definitely an upgrade, I think. But yeah, they will they will hope that he can fill somewhat of a void. And as for Tottenham, the club he's leaving, Tottenham maybe have they've signed Mateus Fernandes, Sandro Tonali, Van Hecke, Robertson, and all that. Good signings under Roberto De Zerbi potentially. However, they've lost Romero now to Atletico Madrid. They've lost Vicario to Juventus, and like a few of the players that you'd probably bank on being a game changer for Tottenham, Kulusevski and Madison are very inconsistent with their injuries. Xavi Simons, you know, until this summer he was, I believe, Tottenham's record signing. Maybe I can't quote me on that, but I think maybe he was. But yeah, he underperformed a bit last year. Who knows? Maybe he will up his game this year and do a bit more for Tottenham. I don't know. But under Roberto De Zerbi, it's going to be an interesting team for Tottenham. Do I think they're probably going to finish again like they were, 17th, with 1 point between them and relegation? I'm going to say probably not. I don't think that there's any team that can spend 200 million and be that close to relegation. But I will say that if there's any team that can spend that much and get close to relegation, it's Tottenham. They've Daniel Levy might be gone, but they still haven't really got a grip together. But Roberto De Zerbi's a good coach. I think we've seen him at Brighton, we've seen him at Marseille. He's done very well. He's done lots of good stuff, and so yeah, I think that Tottenham. Am I scared of them? Probably not. But there is a conversation to be had about what Tottenham can do, and the first step for them obviously is breaking into the top half of the table, and then you go from there. But yeah, that is going to conclude this episode of the Nutmegs and Eastlands podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll hopefully see you again very soon. In a bit. Nutmegs and Eastlands is very grateful for all the great fan support we've been getting over the last few months. And now we're taking it to another level. We're now on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Spotify. If you enjoy the podcast, give us a follow, a like, a subscribe, anything you can. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again very soon.